Podcast. This is your host, Joseph Johnson, and I'm here today with Cam Josse, co-author of The Process with Dr. Fergus Connolly, and excited to kind of really dive into the book, into the details of the book, giving everybody a chance to kind of have a sneak peek, if you will, at the different chapters. And we're gonna talk in detail, not an overall arching kind of idea, but more of a step by step what's in the book. So we're really excited for that. And as always, we're sponsored by ourselves, UA Concepts. So check out the books there along with The Process. I've got it here. It's been out for 3 weeks, maybe up to a month. It's doing really well. We're getting really good feedback on it. And before we get started, we got to send our shout out to the Niners: Dustin Perry, Shea Thompson, Ben Peterson, some of the best guys in the world. Thanks for the gear, guys. I hope you're enjoying the books. So Cam, welcome to the podcast. Nice to meet you.
Thanks, Matt. It's nice to finally get on this podcast with you, and I've been a huge fan of what you're doing with Ultimate Athlete Concepts for years. So when I was an intern in strength and conditioning, I bought all the books and read all of them, and it just your company and your work really helped springboard me to where I am now. So I just really appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much. That's really cool to hear, and that's always been our aim, to kind of take the bar up a little higher and give the best information as possible. So I definitely appreciate that. So with you saying that, with what you've been, how you came along, what's your background? How did you get started here?
Yeah, so my background really, I work for DeFranco's gym. So I've been working with Joe DeFranco. I started as an athlete with him when I was in high school, and then I would shadow him a little bit in college, and I just decided this is what I want to do. I love seeing what he's doing, helping prepare athletes, and I know just going through the program how it felt for me to be in the program and feel my body change, feel my abilities change, and it's just amazing how far everything's come since back then. But it really made me want to learn everything I could about how athletes perform, what helps them perform better. So that's where, when I went to college and I played college football and I studied kinesiology, really got into the field. And that's when I found your books and started reading a little bit more deeply into just all the theories that are out there about sports training. And from there, it just proliferated, it just continued to compound and I just kept diving down deeper rabbit holes. And so now working with Joe DeFranco still, working for his brand, and my title is Director of Sports Performance for DeFranco's gym. So I'm just in charge of doing all the research, finding all the ways we can program and make things more efficient, more effective. And it's a full-time job all the time, trying to stay on the cutting edge, if you will. So that's kind of my background and how I got to where I am now.
So how did you meet Fergus? What was the evolution of your guys' relationship?
Well, with Fergus, it started by I found out about Game Changer, his first book, and so I got the book, and because naturally I'm always trying to learn more about sports performance, and here he was making some claims from his career that were a little bit different than what you're hearing. At that point I was reading pretty much only physical preparation books and just thinking about everything from a physical preparation standpoint. Here was this guy starting to talk about the game and the principles of the game and the laws of the game and starting to understand the game better, which will then help us understand how we prepare athletes a little bit better. And so I love that book. That book really changed my life. So I told Joe DeFranco, I said, you got to get this guy, Fergus Connolly, on your podcast, Joe's Industrial Strength Show podcast. So we reached out to him, we got him on the podcast, and that was an awesome show, awesome opportunity to sit there and just talk to this guy he's just got a wealth of knowledge for, his 20 years or so he's been working in high level team sport. And from there, we stayed in touch after that podcast, and I wrote this idea that I had that was supposed to be just an article for a website. I said, what do you think about this? I'm applying the principles from Game Changer, trying to put them into what can be done with football, American football. And he read it, and I guess he liked it, and he came back and he said, you know what, I think you should save this. Don't turn it into an article. And what do you think about just writing a book about this together? And I was just like taken aback because I loved his work, and I just said that would be an awesome opportunity, an awesome chance to just be able to work alongside you, learn from you, put things on paper. And as we started diving deeper into the project, we realized that there's so much here that we can talk about. I think we're going to have to make this a series, not just one book. And so that's how we got into the process of the process, if you will.
Right. So by the way, I put this out there too. There's going to be multiple levels. So this is level 1. Level 2 probably we'll be seeing maybe in the next 8 to 10 weeks, somewhere in that ballpark. There'll be a level 3, and I believe a level 4, which is tell me what that's about. The level 4. I know it's a little bit different than just a textbook.
Yeah, so level 1, 2, and 3 are basically just progressing in terms of the detail. Level 1 is really just a theoretical introduction of what we're going to be talking about throughout the series, and then from there we really dive down into I did a lot of work to try to provide a lot of research, citation, and we're trying to explain more the practicality of how to use the principles we present in level 1, and then by the time we get to level 4, the idea with that was basically just to make a really practical workbook oriented text. So it's just going to be, hey, great, I see this 7-day cycle, but what if I have a game on Monday and then a game on Thursday? How do I switch up my weekly schedule for that? Or, hey, I don't play American football, I play basketball. What differences are there for that? So so that level 4 is really just going to be, let's lay out a couple, as much as we can, just different practical ways of how we can apply these principles and just show them like the templates of what we might do for high school, college, professional, any team sport we can think of or provide examples for. So it's just different ways to take the ideas and just, it's going to be strictly a practical workbook, basically.
It kind of caps off the toolbox with practical matters of taking the concepts and being able to apply them. Yes. In that format. So for everyone who's listening or watching, we'll be breaking these up into several months spacing, but there will be 4 products, 4 levels. So keep your eyes open for that. We'll let everybody know when they release. So, and by the way, your introduction, talking about Fergus too, one of my absolute favorite people in the field, and he's genuine and just as down to earth as you possibly could be. Just a really good, authentic guy, and it's been an absolute pleasure for me to be working with him. So it's been a cool experience for me. I've known Fergus from way back, but this is the first time we worked together. And to be honest, I was kind of flattered the same way you were when he asked me to publish the book. I'm like, wow, all right. I didn't expect that, but definitely took it as a compliment, and I count it as an honor to be able to do this with you guys. So we're going to get right into this. We're not going to waste any time with too much philosophy. We're going to get right into the book. So I've got the book in front of me, looking at the different chapters, and I'd like to just go through each chapter and have you kind of give us some bullet points as to what those chapters are about, kind of fill us in, give a sneak peek onto the entirety of the book instead of just kind of a philosophical explanation. So the first meaningful chapter is 3 with the winning model. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so that whole section was really, we wanted to lay the groundwork for just trying to talk about some things that might be controversial or misunderstood when it comes to team sports. So the whole premise of the book is we have to look at the game in the context of the game, which means there's a very holistic framework we need to look at. So this chapter here is really referring to starting with the game and understanding what the laws of the game are and what some of the paradoxes of team sport play might be as well. So when I say laws of the game, these are things that are, to a degree, they're very common sense, but it's just stuff that people they lose track of, or they don't think of how important they really are. So an example might be the law of time and space, right? So what we talk about is what people perceive as having a lot of time in team sport is really about having space or being able to create space. So if you're a player that's able to search effectively for space, create space for yourself, it's going to be perceived by the viewers as, wow, he's got great vision, he's got so much time. How did he just react so quickly? But really, it's just this player is able to understand space manipulation, which gives the perception that he's manipulating time, basically. So,
Yeah.
like, if you look at a quarterback, if we talk about a quarterback having all day to throw, like he's sitting there, like, look how much time he has to throw. Well, that's because his linemen are creating space for him. So, and we have to look at space as well in terms of effective field space, where if space doesn't exist in one area of the field, by default, it has to exist somewhere else. So if we're trying to run through this alleyway that's clogged up with defenders or something, we can't go that way. They're closing it down, but that means that there's space somewhere else. So how do we help players understand to continue to search for effective field space, which really just refers to usable field space? Another great example that I love is the law of exposure, and that's basically referring to how players that are exposed to the best forms of opposition are going to have to step up their game literally to overcome that opposition. So it becomes about survival of the fittest. So in order for the player to survive, that player is going to have to continue to elevate their ability to solve problems on the fly. So if we take a player who is just a great offensive player in any sport, they can just create space, they can get around. It could be a running back in football, it could be a player in soccer trying to make a score, it could be a point guard in basketball, it could be any sport. Let's say we know that we have to shut that player down because they're a scoring threat, right? The more we expose that player to challenges, like let's put two people on him or something like that, then the more this player is going to be like, well, if I'm going to be effective, I need to solve this problem. And then all of a sudden you're faced with, we put two people on him, it's not enough. How do we stop him now? Like it just continues to, we put our best player on this person from our side, but every every team he faces every week is putting their best player on him. So that means he's just getting better and better and better every single week. So that means that our players have to continue to get better, better, better. So it's just law of exposure. That's one example there, and it could come to the exposure of our practices, and it could and the training that's involved. So what the players are exposed to, that's going to determine what kind of players they ultimately end up being in the game. So it's cool just to talk about different laws of the game from that standpoint. And then we also talk about the paradoxes of the game. So these are things that my favorite one is the paradox of fitness, because I work in strength and conditioning, physical preparation, sports performance, whatever you want to call it. It's all the same in terms of just preparing players physically to play the game. And I know I was one of these people for sure, but I know that a lot of these people still exist in the field where say we're watching a team on Sunday in the NFL and they don't do too well, or they're just getting beat up by the other team. We're going to sit here and say, well, as strength coaches, we're going to say that team, the players are just out of shape. Their strength coach sucks. Like, there's no results because they're just out of shape. Well, what we're forgetting about is, especially at the pro level and high level college, is that all the players are going to physically be in pretty similar shape. I mean, players are recruited from high school because of their physicality. Players are drafted into the NFL because of their physicality. So, in terms of fitness, for the most part, it's going to be fairly level. So we have to return back to more of the object of the game and how it's played. So it's really about not just tactical and technical preparation on the individual level for each player, but how they collectively come together as a team. So it's important for us to understand the context, where it might not be that they're out of shape. It might just be that as a unit and as a team, maybe you have too many star players on the same team and they don't know how to think outside of themselves or something like that, right? So there's this whole paradox of fitness where if we falsely assume that the players are not in shape enough and we start running them into the ground, that's a problem too, where we can't just, we have to look at everything in context before we make these big time assumptions there as well. So and that goes into the paradox of speed as well. You could think of how we want to have the fastest players available to us. No question. I will never dispute the fact that I'm always going to try to improve a player's speed as measured through sprinting tests or whatever it might be. I want to have really fast players. I know that for sure. But I also understand that if a player is out there on the field literally running as fast as they can. They're going to be out of control. They might be out of position. And Fergus is a great example, because when he did work with Welsh Rugby and they started using GPS technology to monitor those games, what he started seeing with that earlier on was that the players that were the better players, they gave the appearance that they were playing fast, but really they were playing effectively. So they were just making the right decision at the right time. So the GPS was picking up their speeds, and their speeds were not even close to their actual maximum speeds. But then you look at the players that were not as prepared from a technical tactical standpoint, they were caught out of position a lot, so they actually had to sprint to make up for their mistakes. So they were showing faster speeds, but it's about who's the better player. So that's another paradox associated with team sports. So that chapter there just kind of discusses different laws and paradoxes that are important to think about.
That's great. It reminds me of like when the guys go to combines and things like this, and I always tell people, I'm like, the guy who blows the combine up typically is never the best player.
Right. Yeah.
And the best player is, especially for strength, is probably the best, most drastic example. Like, the strongest guy is never even close to being the best guy.
That's true.
Yeah. Like you used to watch those NFL strongman contests. You didn't even know who the guy was.
Right.
The guy that won, like, who's he? What team's he play on?
Yeah, the guy that 40 plus reps on the bench press, and
right.
You haven't heard of him before. Yeah.
You didn't even know who didn't even know who he was. So that's a great example of that idea. Okay, so moving along, we got in the next section, the game model. What's going on there?
Yeah, so this was adapted from Game Changer, and I just tried to dive a little bit deeper into it in the process level 1, because with this, when I read Game Changer the first time and Fergus presented this idea of this game model, for me it really changed my entire thinking, because you hear strength coaches talk all the time about, we all accept the fact we got to work backwards from the game, right? Like, it's just common knowledge at this point. Most strength coaches understand that. But how many of us have a framework to do that, where we can actually do that and understand the game in context? So presenting the game model, I think it might be a mistake for some coaches to read this section and say, I don't need to worry about this. Like, this is common sense, or this is just sport coach's realm. Like, let me get to the part where we're talking about preparing the player, physically or whatever it might be. Whereas I think this is a very important chapter, in my opinion, because this changed my thinking a lot, because it gave me the blueprint to understand the game at a principled level, that now when I'm designing training activities or training games or just experiences for my players, I'm basing it on the principles associated with this game model approach. And the nice thing about this is that it's not any team sport that involves invasion, where we're invading somebody's territory. So that's, pretty much all team sports at that point. Baseball, not really. Baseball's more of, you hit a ball and it goes to the field. But if you think of sports like hockey, lacrosse, soccer, American football, there's some type of end zone, some type of goal you're trying to get there, right? So all of these principles and moments and things associated with this game model can be applied to all of those invasion team sports. So for me, it just, when you think about the fact that no matter what the team sport is, that it all just comes down to 4 macro principles of the game, 4 primary game principles. It's amazing, because you think about every sport's going to have structure and formation. So the players are going to align themselves somehow, and they're going to formulate themselves somehow. And that's going to determine what they're doing tactically and how they're going to behave on the level of the game in terms of individual behavior, unit behavior, and team behavior. So how they're structuring themselves will also determine space manipulation. Then you have ball movement. All players have to be aware of where the ball is, whether they have possession of the ball or not, and they have to be aware of where the ball's going and try to figure out, are we trying to pass it to our teammates? Are we trying to intercept it, or whatever the goal might be tactically, right? So ball movement's another principle. Player movement. Where are my opponents? What are they doing? Where are my teammates? What are they doing? I have to understand the player movement at all times. What am I doing as as the individual? Like, what's my movement role here? What am I doing there? And then player relationships would be the 4th principle, in terms of the sequencing and timing of actions that are associated with all the other principles. So all these principles are constantly present at all times. Doesn't matter if it's offense, if it's defense, and the side that dominates these principles more, the side that can align themselves better, more consistently, understand ball movement better and be more consistent with that, move their players around, have better timing, better sequencing between each other, and understanding what their opponents are doing from a sequencing and timing standpoint, that's going to be the team that's going to dominate. That's the one that's going to win. It's the one who adheres better to these overall game principles. From there we can discuss different moments, which makes sense as well. You have offense, you have defense, and you have transitions between offense and defense. So in most sports, we understand that makes a lot of sense. Most of these invasion team sports, where at any point in basketball, the ball can be turned over. Anytime in soccer, it can be turned over. So if we break the game down into moments, it just allows coaches to analyze the game better, because it's like, hey, when we gave up this interception or when the ball was turned over, how did our players respond? Did we immediately group and try to put bodies on that ball and make sure that the other team could not take advantage of that and score? These are things that sound like common sense, but if you break it down into these digestible chunks, it's going to allow everybody to scout what they're doing, analyze their game performance a little bit better with context. So we look at what's the moment, how are the players adhering to these different game principles, right? And so we can just, you could have different goals for different moments as well, where if we're looking about offensive play, we have different micro moments where we have to construct ourselves into a formation. We have to penetrate our opponent's territory, and then we have to successfully complete what we're trying to do. It could be football, where obviously maybe you're trying to pass the ball somewhere, see if you can execute that play. Or in basketball, you can drop a play as well that we execute properly with the pick and roll and get to the basket. So that's where we look at different moments and try to figure out, as we're going through those moments, are we operating the way we need to as a team? And then, from there, there's further principles that are just based on which side of the ball you're playing at that moment. So the primary principle of offense makes a lot of sense. It's just create space. How do we create space for who has the ball? How does the ball carrier himself or herself create their own space? Can they make somebody miss? And that's a characteristic we want to see from wide receivers in football, running backs in football, point guards in basketball. So how do they get around their opponents? Defense would just be the opposite. How do we take space away, right? So if you're a coach, whatever you're doing, if you have an offensive player, it's all going to come back down to, did you create space? So it sounds simple, but you see a lot of coaches just giving these elaborate examples to players, like, you got to go to here and line up here and do that and do this. But at the end of the day, if the player knows, I got to create space, we give the example of how a lot of wide receivers in football don't want to run block. They just want to catch the ball, run their route, score touchdowns. But they need to understand that if they are not run blocking for the running back, then they're going directly against the primary macro principle of offense, which is to create space. So now they're just totally going against their tactical aim and being selfish, and that's not good for the team. That's not going to help us win. So that's where those are important. And then, we break things down even further into micro principles, which we don't really have to get too deep into that. But it would just be, if we're telling the offense to create space, what are the micro principles of how to actually create space? So, the offense has to support each other. The players have to support each other. We have to attack the width and the depth of the field or the court. We have to be balanced in the attack in terms of, in football, can we pass the ball well? Can we run the ball well? What's the balance? And just little micro principles like that. So that's what we go over in that whole game model aspect, is just trying to understand the game from different moments and different principles that allow for more digestible chunks for the coaches and the players too.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear in those terms of just creating space. But yeah, I mean, that's you. My middle son plays basketball a lot, and we talk about that all the time. It's creating space. If you create space, it's hard for the defense to do anything with you if you know how to do that. And what are the things you need to do to create space? What are the steps or different strategies, qualities that need to be improved? That's interesting. Going into the next section of preparing the player, and I guess this gets a little bit more into the specifically to your own area of expertise.
Yeah.
What's that look like?
Yeah, so that's really just, we're trying to present, really the biggest part of this chapter is the 4 coactive model of player preparation, where a lot of strength conditioning professionals understand this, because the 4 coactives really just refer to tactical preparation, technical preparation, psychological preparation, and physical preparation. So it's our belief, and our meaning Fergus and me, that most of us are overemphasizing the physical preparation realm But if you look at the 4 coactive, if we just divided them up into equal importance, and each one represents 25% of what's important for preparing a player, physical preparation is just 1/4 of what really goes into developing an entire player. So here's the chapter that's interesting, where I love going over the tactical and technical side, just understanding the importance of those, because and definitely the psychological as well. But the tactical and technical side, now that really brings to light the importance of communication between the sport coach and the strength coach. Because if we look at the game model from the previous chapter that we just discussed, that in theory should help provide a basic framework for communication between the sport coach and everybody else involved in the entire organization. So it could be the strength coach, could be a nutrition staff, could be sports psychology, sports medicine. If everybody understands the game on a principled level, then it allows their approach to the game preparation process to be more efficient, more in line with what the coach wants. So if we're looking at the tactical coactive, we always have to understand the tactical context. So something that's interesting is if we put on a sports game and we see somebody mess up where it's obvious, right? We don't always know who to blame for something being messed up. If some guy misses a tackle and it results in a touchdown, maybe that guy wasn't even supposed to be there. Maybe he was trying to do his best to make up for somebody else who messed up tactically, and then he was caught out of position because everything was just chaos and nuts, right? So the tactical context is important. We have, especially when coaches are recruiting players or drafting players, to understand how they can step right in on their team. If they understand the tactical context of how things are happening in the game, that's going to allow them to really understand what kind of player that is. And that's the realm of the sport coach for the most part, right? So us, the strength coaches, we're not going to be as concerned with the tactical coactive. That's the realm of the sport coach. We have to account for it and understand. And the technical coactive is really just about how well do our players execute within the technical aspects of their position, of how does the unit work together, and then how does the team as a whole just execute. So tactical is really about just knowing what you need to do, and technical is about actually executing it and doing it and having the ability to perform your sport skills. So here's where, as strength and conditioning coaches, we can have somewhat of an influence if we understand the techniques and what the coaches are looking for. So I said on other podcasts not too long ago that imagine being a sport coach and you send your players off in the off season to the strength coach, and your communication is awesome with the strength coach. So you tell the strength coach, hey, you know what? If we use football as the example, I want players that are going to be able to play man coverage if I'm a defensive coordinator. So I want to have players that can cover guys in man. I can call those plays tactically. I want them to have that ability. So the strength coach says, great, I will do my best to help you out with that. What technique are you teaching? How do you want them to cover guys in man? Because what I can do is I can design agility or game-oriented drills or activities as part of the off-season training where they're getting some exposure to that every week against our team's best players. Our defensive backs are covering our best wide receivers. We're scaling the complexity. Some of our guys that need more developmental work, will give them more volume against some of our tougher receivers, so they start stepping up their game. They prove to be quality reserve backups for us. You can come together with the sport coach now and determine like what are the technical things you want to work on in the off season. So now we can bridge that gap there. So we're not really involved with the tactics, but we can continue to reinforce the movement, the technique, the execution in what we're doing, right? And then obviously the psychological coactive. Here we're just talking about a player's ability to have emotional intelligence. This is just going to be who the player is as a person, but we have to account for it, understand who they are. How do they handle their emotions? Who are they as an individual? We can't just look at them as a physical specimen who does all these things. We have to understand who they are as a person. That's going to help the entire process, if you will. And how do they learn? How do we get the message across to this particular player? We might have a physical specimen who could do all the amazing physical things we want him to do from a technical physical standpoint. But if he's got a unique way of how he learns, we need to learn what that is and try to help him out. Maybe we keep him after practice, review a couple more things or whatever. And then spirituality as well. How do we create this environment where the players all feel welcome? They all feel part of something bigger than themselves, and they really believe, they really buy in. How do we work on that? So that's where we're looking at with the psychological components, understanding the players as people first, players second, right? And obviously the physical coactive is, if you're a strength conditioning professional, self-explanatory. Here this is absolutely something that's important, and we got to make sure that the players have the foundational qualities to physically operate and stay on the field, which is probably the most important thing in high level sport, is how do we keep players on the field, right? So obviously the physical coactive is going to have a lot bigger of an influence when kids are in a developmental stage, middle school, high school, maybe some young college players as well that don't quite have the physical development. But once you have upperclassmen in college and you have players that are professional, at that point it's really about how do we physically prepare them to stay on the field where they can continue to operate tactically and technically to just continue to elevate their game. But obviously here we're talking about strength, speed, power, endurance, mobility, all the necessary underlying physical traits we want to see in ensuring that players can play and have enough fitness to operate effectively in their game.
Yeah, that's you brought up an interesting point there, and this is going to lead into the next subject, but the health of the players. Um, you know, at the pro level, probably especially, and I believe at the collegiate level, but I'm for certain at the pro level that they've spent exceedingly larger and larger amounts of money and time on preserving the health of players, so they're not losing them. And the fact of the matter is they're not really making any progress. I think injuries are no different than they ever were. I know that that was a couple of years ago. I was kind of paying attention to it a little bit more, that like in August, the NFL had guys dropping like flies. I mean, it was like, they haven't even had really a lot of contact yet. They were dropping 50, 60, 70 guys already with fairly serious injuries, right? And Major League Baseball, probably 5 years ago, had more Tommy John surgeries by Memorial Day than they had the previous year. It's like, how's that even possible? We're supposed to know so much more now, and we're paying, we're spending this money and hiring these theoretically elite people in the area of rehab, but here we are still, right? So I think that's ironic, that we spent. I've said this over and over again. Like, it's amazing how we're still chasing our tail on that one a little bit, not really getting to the root of it and fixing it. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. And talking with Fergus, we're not going to claim that we have the answer. That's for sure. It's obviously multifactorial, super complex, but there's so many layers to it. And in our discussions, we've talked about how you have to look at it from all the different layers, all the different contexts. And not to mention, if you're going to bring in all these specialists and all these tools, from a sports science standpoint, or the whole idea of having this game model principled approach where everybody understands the game and understands what everybody else is doing, the communication side, I think, is going to prove to be what's going to help the most. Is just if everybody stays in their own bucket of thinking, where, well, I went to physical therapy school, I learned this. Well, I went to massage therapy school, I learned this. I went to whatever, I went to athletic training school and I learned this. So everybody thinks like they're right, because they came from their bucket of thinking, their bucket of education, rather than cross-pollinating, talking to each other and figuring things out. Like, hey, coach, if you're having a guy throw X number of throws, just so you're aware from what we're seeing from our expertise, this is the amount of physical stress that's being put on the guy's elbow, or whatever that might be, whatever that might look like. So, right. And the other thing that was interesting to me was reading just some of the research on collision and how, with the CBA, the collective bargaining agreement rules, and how we're trying to minimize collision so much rather than scale collision almost, where players are kind of, I guess, like the uneducated way to put it is developing a callus, right, to collision. But if you take American football players and they've spent all off season, no collision, and then we get them into, even just training camp where they've done no form of colliding at all whatsoever. And now it's like, hey, let's line up 10 yards away from each other and smash each other, right? There's no scale where, at least in rugby, what happens is they'll start right in front of each other, like, inches away from each other, wrestle each other to the ground, and slowly they scale that into maybe we're 3 meters away from each other. Now we're 5 meters away, because obviously the further the distance, the more velocity is going to be associated with that collision, and that makes the injury risk skyrocket. So we go from zero, like no collision, to hey, you're a free safety. Go smash that running back from 20 yards away.
Yeah, right.
Obviously, players are going to get hurt. So I think we need to do more research in that area to understand collision a little bit better too.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think the whole thing, especially in pro sports, is they go from 0 to 100. And that's a recipe for disaster in many different fronts. Where the guy's not ready physically, he's not ready for the collisions as well. He's not ready for the volume of running. He may not even be ready psychologically.
Right.
Whatever the case may be. So yeah, you got a lot going on there. So on that health component, I mean, I guess this is a segue. How are you guys looking at that?
Well, that's exactly just to fall in line with that. We're trying to look at it from all these different perspectives. So it's not just about physically preparing a player, because if it was, then we could get a player on a Nord board, measure his output, and say, great, if he hits X amount of newtons of output on a Nord board, he'll never pull his hamstring. Well, that's not true. It's a factor that comes into play. Is
Right.
there value to something like a Nord board? Absolutely. Like you need to be able to monitor that eccentric strength load. But I think it's more about we need to monitor that to rule that out as a possibility, right?
Yeah.
So if we can monitor eccentric strength and it's not a limiting factor as to why that guy might pull a hamstring, then we say, great, that's not a risk factor. We can just maintain where he is with that, but we still have to look at some other things. So you brought up a great point when you mentioned a little bit of that psychological stress too, because consider what a lot of these players do in the off season, where they are not acting in any sort of reactive manner, where they're not covering anybody, they're not running against anybody. There's no scaling that's happening there either. So then they show up day one of training camp in football, as an example. And I talk to every NFL strength coach I talk to, for the most part, they'll say our highest volumes that we see on GPS load is week one of training camp, where it's just,
Right.
we've exactly what you're saying. We've done nothing. So, but at the same time, if you think about players having not just like the physical load is going to be super high as measured by GPS, but let's consider the complexity in terms of the perceptual cognitive elements.
Yeah.
So that's what we talk about in the book as well, from a health standpoint, where if you have taken months off of reacting to somebody, right, you're going to be your brain to body response factor is going to be slow. So now day one of training camp, you're out there and you got to react against other NFL players who are amazing, gifted athletes, and they're super fast, and you're sort of rigid because you haven't done it in a while. I mean, what happens? Your body stiffens up, you get all rigid, and your muscles lock up, and that's a recipe for injury as well too. So there is that psychological component in terms of just the stress of being in a position, not to mention the stress of I'm trying to win a job, I'm trying to feed my family. Like there's so many factors that go into injuries that we got to look at all these different layers.
It made me think of one of my kids was just asking me how contracts work at the pro level, and I said, well, in the NBA or the Major League Baseball, you sign a contract, they got to pay you. It doesn't matter what happens; it's guaranteed. I said, in the NFL, it's different. They can cut you whenever they want to.
Yep.
I mean, you fart stinky, and you could be out the door. You don't know. And I think that something that Brian Mann had alluded to before in a talk was that they found that academic stress was just as I guess potent as an inhibitor of performance as physical stress or practice stress. Well, you can imagine then the stress of making the team. You know what I mean? Or the stress of I don't want to get hurt.
Right.
Could actually make you get hurt. I mean, there's ironically, right? So yeah, I mean, when you're looking at this, that first week, the guy's stressed out. I think maybe you probably calm down the second week, but that first week's got to be pretty stressful mentally and emotionally, physically, everything. So the propensity for injury is probably at its very peak that first week of training camp.
Oh yeah.
When in fact it probably should be, much lower, right?
Yeah.
So that's an interesting observation there. That I think when you put all that together, the propensity to get hurt, and then everybody's looking around like wringing their hands. What happened? And we don't know. But you know what I mean. But the answer, I think, is kind of right in front of your face. What happened. The problem is, and I tell this to coaches at the high school level, especially that I deal with and help, is that look, the guy might have been doing something in the weight room or in the training or whatever, and he gets hurt 2 weeks later, and you don't connect the two together. But there was an injury building.
Yeah.
It didn't just go from super healthy to injured. It came in collisions, but a lot of these injuries are not collisions.
Right.
So how is it that you make a cut and you tear a ligament? That did not happen just that moment.
Right.
That's been waiting to happen.
Yeah.
And you just caught it on the right day, at the right time, the right angle, and that's what happened. And a lot of people don't, so I think that, they don't connect. So because they don't connect the dots, they're not looking at it from that point of view. I've said this before. It's a little controversial, but I'll say it anyway. At the high school level, if parents knew how many injuries their kids were related back to the coach, they'd lynch teachers and coaches. And this environment where parents are pretty protective now, more so than in generations past, and they realized that because you ran the kid in the ground, 3 weeks later he had to have surgery on whatever ACL because he tore it in a non-contact injury. And I tell the coach, this is a little bit provocative too, but once again, I don't care. If the kid sustains a non-contact injury, it's probably your fault.
Right.
Probably.
There's some type of loading that was mismanaged somewhere, and but you have to take a layered lens when you're looking at it, because what's interesting to me is if you look at a lot of the accelerometry data that's able to pick up collisions.
Yeah.
If you look at that, a lot of because collision, how do you define it? It's basically just vibrational force that the body has to withstand, right? So Fergus was the first one to explain to me, hey, if you sprint at full speed, there's a lot of collision going on just at the ankle and knee and hip. You don't think of that as colliding with a person, but then, that's a low level collision, but, and then you can scale it up to being hit by somebody else. Right. But
sure.
if you look at the accelerometry data, like the least impactful types of collisions are things like starting from a dead stop, coming out of a sprint, changing direction, landing from a jump, stuff like that. Like those are not as impactful as colliding with another player or even falling on the ground, but those are the most frequent collisions. So it's still vibrational force that the body's got to withstand. We know from studying plyometrics how intense that stuff can be on the body and in the soft tissues and all that. So exactly what you're saying, if we're mismanaging even just physical preparation in terms of just running or sprinting and change of direction and just the collision with the foot on the ground, then that's going to also play a factor into non-contact soft tissue injury, if you will.
Yeah. So for the lower level coaches, high school level coaches that are listening, calm down. More is not better, and you're dealing with kids or teenagers who don't manage the rest of their life very well. So I don't know why you think they come in super prepared anyway. They got enough on their plate. So yeah, calm down. We don't need nearly the volume of work that we're putting in with these kids, and you cannot microwave fitness. It doesn't happen. If he's not in shape 2 weeks before the season starts, that ship's already sailed. You can just it's not happening. You're not going to do it in 2 weeks. You can just forget it. So you're going to have a different plan of attack. So that's my little soapbox. It drives me nuts with coaches. So in the next section, preparing the team, go ahead and fill us in on that.
Sure. Yeah, this is something we're really going to get into in level 2 and level 3. And I'm excited for when we dive deeper into it. But we just present the basic framework for this as well here, where Fergus has a model. He just calls it the VIDC model. And what that refers to is at all times we need to be cognizant of the volume that's happening in practice and training, the intensity. We have to really have a good understanding of what the intensity might be. And that's not always just CNS intensity, central nervous system intensity, where I think a lot of strength coaches will look at a chart from like Charlie Francis or something, motor unit activation chart, and we think that's what intensity is. But talking with Fergus, if you look more into intensity, there's a cognitive intensity associated with it, which we understand too, right? There's an intensive load on players when they learn a new skill, aspects like that. But consider things like extended meetings, long walkthroughs, long film study. All of that is intensive, but then also just playing a team sport where the whole time they call it head on a swivel in football for a reason. You're just turning your head back and forth, looking to find work, looking to see what's going on, diagnosing the situation. There's an intensity component to that as well that's going to stress the brain. So that is still central nervous system intensive,
Yeah.
right? But it's not, you might not think of it because it's not a sprint or an Olympic lift or a throw or something like that. Along the same lines, another one of my pet peeves is when you see strength coaches talk about American football and they say they play about 3 to 6 seconds and they have a 20 to 40-second rest period. And I say that there is no 20 to 40-second rest period. If you've played football, unless it's a timeout, like TV timeout, that's a rest period. But if you're still on the field and the other team's lining up and you're trying to see what they're doing, you're diagnosing, you're trying to get your play from the sideline, that's so stressful, that moment, that you might not be moving physically, but your heart's racing, your brain's activated. So you're just engaged the whole time, right? So there's an intensity component we have to understand better as well when we're designing the practice week. Density, which is just really referring to what's the density of work, how many breaks are we taking. So if we want to stress player speed in practice, we want them to operate at faster speeds. We know by default we need it to have low density because we need to have a good amount of work or high intensity of work, and then we have to give them enough rest to come back and operate at a high speed again. So if we have too much density, fatigue is going to be too great. They're going to start slowing down. Whereas if we're trying to purposely work endurance, we want high density, because now it's like, all right, you go out, you run 3 plays. Next team runs 3 plays. All right, first team, you're back in right now. Something like that.
Yeah.
So density is important to consider as well, because that's going to help us understand the training effect we're getting to. And then the last element of that is collision, and we just talked about it, right? Just trying to take into account all the collision factors, including things like sprinting, changing direction, how much field volume of running are we doing. That's all going to play a factor in the collision, as well as obvious factors in rugby and football, which would be tackling, taking people to the ground, different tempos. Football, you have thud, where you don't actually take a guy to the ground, but you impact him. Just considering when do we place those elements into the week, how do we manipulate those? So that's the VIDC model there: volume, intensity, density, collision. Those are all things we have to consider throughout the week. Then from there, if we're looking at preparing the week of practice and just considering how we go about designing that, a lot of it goes into, what type of work are we exposing the players to, and how long does it take them to recover from that? And then as a third element, what might a training residual be, which, you published the book Block Periodization, where they're talking about training residuals and all that. But it's really interesting to look at all that stuff, because you consider, you give a player a really high intensity practice with a lot of collision, but we know we need to give them at least 48 hours to come back from that, in terms of just having any kind of a similar stimulus there. So that's why we're talking in our book, maybe you place a high intensity, high collision practice earlier in the week, so that you have enough days. You might have 3 to 4, sometimes 5 days of recovery before actual game day, so they have time to recover from that collision, that intensity. So that's the recovery rate we're considering. And then we know there's going to be a residual effect from that too, that there's enough time there where they were exposed to collision that day, so that when they go to get another day of collision on game day, they at least had it earlier in the week. So there's a residual, like, okay, I'm kind of used to this a little bit, Same thing with things like endurance and speed. And we manipulate those based on how we understand that really high intensity elements are probably going to need at least like 2 days to come back from. Whereas if we have more of a lower intensity, even if it feels tough, like you're out of breath, but it's just because we rose the density up, we know that if fatigue is present, the players can't move as fast as they possibly could before. So they might be huffing and puffing from a cardio standpoint, but it doesn't mean that the actual CNS intensity is super high that day. It's more of just a cardio type day, and that's actually going to help with blood flow pumping out, actually might help recover from a higher collision day before. So how do we stagger those into, it could be like a high-low framework if you want to think of it that way, but there's just different ways to do that, where we're preparing the team, not just from the game principles, but also understanding how do we focus on certain game principles based upon the physical emphasis we want to stress in practice throughout the week. And I think that's where it's really interesting to see Fergus's work from that standpoint. Because if you want to stress something like strength, in practice. Strength doesn't have to be limited to the weight room. It could be done in practice. How do we do that in practice? Really shorter distances. Players are colliding into each other, pushing each other around. You think like goal line in football or some type of scrum action in rugby. That's developing strength. Slow speeds. You're running into somebody else. They're slowing you up. You have to overcome their resistance. That's literally the definition of strength, right? Like overcoming resistance. So, whereas if we want to work endurance, hey, we're not going to give you that much rest. Like, how do you operate? And just get out there and keep playing. If it's rugby, it's like maybe we go a 10-minute game instead of a 5-minute game or something. If it's football, maybe it's like, hey, instead of running 3 plays and coming off the field, we're going to run 10 plays in a row. Like, just get on the ball, go. Like, what do you have on play 8, 9, and 10? What's your endurance there? So the coach can figure out tactically what he wants to stress based on the physical stressor as well. Right. So if we want to stress endurance, he can run 2-minute in football. Like, let's get on the ball. Let's run it up tempo. It aligns really well when you look at it. And a lot of it is already being done. It's just, it could be more fine tuned a little bit to really help with the adaptation and training effect based on what we're looking at from a physical stress standpoint.
It's interesting mentioning all the different factors. And the one that sticks out to me is the intensity component, because the average coach, I don't know, do they realize that high intensity can't be repeated day after day? It's just not going to happen. You might think it is, and you might be pushing them, but they're not able to execute at their normal highest level of intensity. I think one of the best examples of this is like track and field, for example, in high school, and they have a practice, and they got 2 meets. I don't even know what you think you're doing. You know what I mean? Like, literally, you run on Tuesday and you run on Friday all out. What are you doing in practice on Monday? You better not be doing too much, or they're not going to be ready. And really, you shouldn't be doing too much on Wednesday for Friday. So track practice in high school, I would dare say, is almost a farce, because in the absence of the coach understanding technique and maybe be able to look at those things, which I don't think a lot of high school coaches are really have that background. Mm-hmm. It's mainly, okay, let's go run. But why?
Yeah.
Even if you sprinted, let's say you sprinted really hard on Wednesday and he doesn't really feel the negative effects on Friday, the body still hasn't adapted to it.
Right.
He's not faster. That's not going to happen. So it's an interesting kind of almost paradoxical, if you will. And it's the same. And then it's hidden a little bit more in team sports, because, you have all these tactical things that are going into the picture. A hard practice, a light practice is, different, in its measurability, and there's a scale. Where in track, if you're running, it's balls out. If it's 100 meters, you're trying to run hard, right? Because running at 30% is going to do us no good. Or whatever or half speed. It's not going to do anything on either side of the fence, unless it was like a recovery idea. But in general, you know what I mean? So it's kind of interesting. I think track and field in high school kind of like it is like the prime example, and then it's hidden a little bit more in layers, like what you said, in team sports like football or whatever. It's, hey, look, we went really hard yesterday, not a lot of rest. The intensity was pretty high. We probably better take it easy today, and work on the other side of that. And kind of lay off, because we still got a game on Friday and you got to be ready.
Yeah, and what with team sport, where it gets even infinitely more complex, is that you could write on paper the most brilliant physical preparation plan, even including the practice, where it's like, hey, here's a strength day in practice and here's a strength day in the weight room. So we're going to do goal lines and more intense collision type stuff in practice. Go to the weight room, we'll do our max effort work that day. And then here's an endurance day where we're going to run up tempo in practice, challenge the players aerobically, and then in physical prep later, or at some point in the day, we might do more strength endurance or hypertrophy, just to align better, more compatibility between those loading. You could write that and that could be perfect, on paper, in theory, right? But then the complexity comes about the tactical considerations as well, where it's like, are they learning the game plan we want them to learn this week? Because at the end of the day, if you could have a day where you're like, hey, we want to stress 2-minute, get on the ball, run fast, and then you put the players out there and there's a mess. Like, they look like complete garbage. At that point, you're like, all right, maybe let's take a second here. They got to know what they're doing first and foremost. And then so that's the challenge for the sport coach is how do you communicate the principles of the players tactically so that they in such an effective way where you really take advantage of your film study, your walkthroughs, all of that. So now if you want to run practice a certain way physically, mentally they've already got it figured out up here. That's a challenge because then now it's like, hey, I want you to run 10 plays in a row. I'm going to call the play out real quick. Just run it. Like, you better know what the play is, right? So that's a whole nother challenge there is you could have the most in shape players physically that are just dominant animals. But if they just don't know, if they don't know what they're doing, you can't out fitness another team that just tactically knows so much more than you do. You might hang with them for 1, 2, maybe 3 quarters, but they're going to come away in the fourth quarter every time. And Fergus learned that lesson the hard way when he was with Welsh Rugby and they had to play the All Blacks. It's like, it didn't matter how fit we were, they were going to beat us every time because they controlled the game tactically. So that's a whole other part of the complexity problem right there.
It's kind of like the reason you look back, the reason why Bobby Knight was successful because he never had the greatest athletes, very rarely. But every guy had 2 or 3 titles. I mean, you got to explain that some way, and they executed, and that was it's kind of an example of that being the case. Moving on to the morphocycle. Fill me in on that.
Yeah, so that's really I previewed it a little bit there, right? But basically, what we're doing with this morphocycle is it's a fancy term, obviously, but it just means morpho just refers to the fact that it's alive, it can change. It's just it's and the cycle is going to refer to a 7-day cycle. Like, what does our week look like leading into game day? So from one game to the next, what does our preparation plan look like in terms of everything I just talked about before? What are we looking at in terms of physical stress? What are we looking at in terms of tactical complexity and helping players learn, right? So there's all these different factors that are involved. And this morphocycle approach comes from Vitor Frade, who wrote about tactical periodization. And he was, his whole philosophy is really just about, and Fergus studied with him directly, which is a wealth of knowledge right there, but it's just about really working backwards from the game and all of the layers associated with that. So Fergus touched on this in Game Changer. We touch on it here. We're going to dive even deeper into it in level 2, level 3, and then show a bunch of different examples of morphocycles for different sports and different levels of sport in level 4 in the workbook and the templates. So, let's just be hypothetical here. We'll use American football as the example because that's what we use in level 1 here. So you have a game day. On game day, everyth's at 100%. In theory, it might not actually end up that way, but in theory, we're thinking max volume, max intensity, max, game specific density, collision. Players are emotionally 100% involved, psychologically 100% involved, and everything you can think of is just, we're maximizing everything on this day, right? In theory, that's what we're assuming, 100% game load across the board. So we just call that day execution. Like, that's the day you just go out and execute. And we know that's a huge load on the players in theory. Maybe sometimes you have an easier game or whatever. But in theory, we're assuming that's going to be a really intense day there. So what I learned from Fergus, which was interesting, and he did this when he was with the 49ers, and I know that the Philadelphia Eagles do something like this too, which is they actually give the players a day off the day following the game, where I know most teams in American football will bring the players in the day after the game. They'll do film review. They'll do a little bit of some type of lift or physical preparation of some sort, and then they give them the day off the next day. Whereas what we propose here, based on what I learned from Fergus, is if you take that first day off after the game. So if we play on Sunday, right? If you take Monday off, that's going to allow the coaches to come in, formulate some type of game plan that is more sound, and they can really filter their message together. It's just the coach's day to come in. They all talk about, they watch the film together, they figure out what's the message they want to deliver to the team, and how do we get a jump start on the game plan for our next opponent, so we know what we want to clean and correct, and then how do we get the game plan going forward into our next opponent there. So meanwhile, the players have that day off. That allows them to have an emotional recovery day. So yeah, physiologically, you might want to get a player in right away and jumpstart his physical recovery with that. But if we look at the entire holistic picture of team sport preparation, if we're talking psychologically, it might be a wasted day, because they might come in if they had a bad game, they're going to be depressed. If they had a good game, maybe they went out and partied all night, and they're going to come in and they're going to be shot mentally either way. So it's better to give them that day off in a way when you think about it. Let them have some time with their families, let them schedule some things with their kids or whatever that might be if they are professional athletes. We're using the NFL as an example here. And that gives the coaches that full day to figure out what they want to do. Players can still come in and they can do some recovery work on their own if they want to. Whereas the following day after that, we're going to call it the gradual theme of that day is just activate, right? So now it's review what we did in the past game with the coaches. Let's install some new stuff we want to focus on for the week to follow. We're doing some walkthrough, some film study, nothing too crazy from a sports practice standpoint. But then we can also talk about regeneration. We're going to start getting some physical recovery associated with it. Put some players through some activities, let them run around a little bit, use some running activities, maybe some positional work, just to use some similar stimuli that cause their fatigue. We want to use that at a lower intensity and just jumpstart the recovery process heading into the week. So we're just trying to rev them up on that day a little bit, get them back into the facilities, into the organization, and review, install, and regenerate a little bit. So following that day, so that, in our model, if we played Sunday, that would have been on a Tuesday right there. So if we get into a Wednesday, now, we're 1, 2, 3 days out from the past game at that point, right? So that now they've had about 72 hours, including a regeneration day, which hopefully will have jump-started some recovery there as well. So now they've had about 72 hours to recover from that game physically, mentally, emotionally. So because of that, we want to apply a strength day here where we can expose them to high intensity, high collision, and start gradually working into some micro principles of the game as well. So it might be a day that's focused a lot on the position. So the positional coach has more say on this day. It's more of an individualized day, stressing the players in terms of just putting them into situations of we're trying to jumpstart the week. This might be a padded practice. If we're going to use pads, we'll do it here. And the reason for that is it's 3 days following the last game. So they've had 3 days of recovery physically, and it allows them to have 1, 2, 3, 4, or 4 or 5 days leading into the next game, right? So now it's kind of perfectly placed in theory where they've had enough recovery. They might not feel totally great, but they've had enough recovery just in terms of having 3 days of physical recovery. And now we're going to give them another probably 4 days to recover after this day leading into game day. So that's why we placed that earlier in the week. Let's just get that higher intensity, high collision day out of the week there, that strength emphasis day. So that's the day if we're going to go to the weight room, we can focus on strength that day too. That's the day to just kind of push it a little bit, see what we got. Following that day, we might do an endurance oriented day where now we're going to focus on the unit. Maybe it's like the full defense comes together, the full offense comes together, where, just up tempo work. All these days can feature different layers of the team in terms of position, unit, and team periods. But an endurance day allows for plays to happen, volume to happen. You can get higher volume of practice, and we can increase a player's endurance and use high density there too to build an aerobic effect. So now, they're going to have this nice endurance aerobic effect. So they're feeling like they're working really hard, but we know just from a science standpoint that the aerobic effect is actually going to help mitigate some of the stress from the high collision day before. And then they're still going to allow them to have like 3 days of recovery in terms of endurance before they lead into the next game. So following that endurance day, you could have more of a speed day where here's probably just going to be helmets, right? And when we say speed, the players can be moving fast for sure. And we want to see that, but really it's about crispness of running the plays, speed from the neck up, as it were. So the decision-making speed needs to be nice and high. So it might be pretty much only team periods for the most part, maybe a little bit of positional unit work as well, but a lot of team periods where it's like get on the ball, execute for 2 to 3 plays, get off, rotate through it, let's get the next team in. Everybody be crisp, everybody go. So we have that strength, endurance, and speed day. Collectively, those 3 days are really the primary days for skill acquisition and development. And that's where the new game plan is going to come into fruition gradually as the week goes on. And we've stressed the new game plan from a position emphasis to unit emphasis to team emphasis leading into that final speed day. So then what do we have left? We got a day before the game. That's our day to review and refine from a tactical standpoint. And from a physical standpoint, we're focusing on recovery. If we've traveled, we really got to focus on recovery on that day, But even if we're home, it's just let's recover and restore. We just had 3 pretty tough practice days. Let's recover a little bit. Let's figure out how we do that the best with our sports science staff, our strength and conditioning staff, our nutrition staff. Everybody comes together on that, and then we're back to game day. We're getting it going. So that's kind of just I like the term Joel Smith used when we talked to him, which was a utopian model, if you will. Like in a perfect world, here's what it might look like. In real life, it might never look like this, but it's just you have to have some kind of plan in place and then manipulate it from there. So that's the idea with the whole morphocycle is just we want to show you stress different things throughout the week, not just physically, but also tactically and accounting for things like psychological stress and all of that.
Yeah, I did. I like that point that you made. I've given that to coaches. So I said, look, I'm going to give you the ideal model, and then you tell me how your real world works, and then we'll work around that. But
right.
You got to at least have the ideal model so you know what you're shooting for, and you understand what you're giving up or getting when you're making decisions, in that way. Because if you don't do that, then it kind of gets a little blurry, on how those decisions should be made. Now, in the next section, you guys talk about using games to prepare for games.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm assuming like some of this, what you just talked about kind of leads into that as well, of getting ready for the next week.
Yeah, well, this whole chapter is really about using games in the off season, actually.
Okay, my bad.
Yep. But because it's going to happen in sports practice, obviously. You're going to do small-sided games all the time, right?
Sure.
Football, it could be team periods. Basketball, it's just scrimmages, things like that. So
right.
We're talking about bringing in aspects of gameplay and using generalized, almost physical education-oriented games in the off-season. So exactly for what the point I brought about before, which is how do we keep a level of reactivity and perception action coupling intact throughout the year, especially for a sport like football where they have a really long off season, right? So, sports like baseball, sports like basketball, they don't have a huge off season. Volleyball plays a lot with all the club teams and all that. So in sports like that, you should still consider it and understand if you have ways you can do it. It's important, but definitely for a sport like football, where the sport is just so injurious and we have to just take such a layered approach to it. If we can help players perform in game-like actions that involve the perception action cycle in the off season, that's going to help their brain-body connection, like I talked about before. So maybe now, if we've done this in the off season, when they go to training camp, the hope is that they've been reacting to people this whole time, so that initial, hey, you got to go cover this guy with pads on now. It's like, well, I've already covered that guy, but now I just have pads on, and it's specific to the tactics of what I'm doing. But I've done this physically and technically. So that's the idea. And basically, we have 2 different categories of off-season games. The first one is just matchup games. So for that, you're diluting the gameplay down to the one-on-one level, if you will. So it's just a matchup. You could do 1-on-2 or even 2-on-2 if you wanted to, but it's just a really diluted down at the 1-versus-1 level. The most intense part of the game comes down to one-on-one interactions for the most part. In soccer, if a guy goes to shoot a goal, it's usually he's got one last guy to get around before he takes the shot. Same thing in hockey or basketball. So in football, obviously, if you can show the ability to get by somebody or go up and make a catch on a pass on like a goal line fade or something like that, those are really important matchup situations that are going to lead to points and potential victory. So how do we expose our players to those stressful situations so that they're prepared for that psychologically, physically, and technically? So that's important too, is with using these games, what we can do is come together, meet a little bit more in the middle with the sport coach, where we're applying that technical aspect and psychological aspect that's specific to that moment in the game, where the players are going to learn to cope with that anxiety in the off season with a layered progression approach, instead of just we've done none of it and now go to training camp. So
yeah.
the matchup games could be just basic evasion, get by that guy, or it could be maybe like a mirror game or something, stay with this guy. And it doesn't have to just be lateral mirroring like the classic combine lineman drill, but it could be, hey, I'm I'm going to give this guy the freedom to move wherever he wants to go in this space, and you just got to stay with him. Like that's a mirror type activity there. So it could be just any situation that you're looking at like that. So we call those matchup games from that standpoint. And then we have multiplayer games. So multiplayer games, now we're going to focus on group dynamics at a reduced level as well. So maybe it's 3-on-3, 4-on-4, 5-on-5. You could work up to 7-on-7, but obviously the more people you add, the more complex and chaotic it gets. So if we want to help player fitness levels, but still expose them to game activities where they can't hide behind other players, I think it's better to keep it 3-on-3, 4-on-4, 5-on-5, because now it allows the coach to really see if anybody's plotting or not really doing anything. And from there, we have a progression that we present in the book where first we start with lower complexity, small spaces, right? So we're thinking in multiplayer games, we're thinking formation-focused games is what we call them. So that could be, Joe DeFranco here at DeFranco's has used med ball volleyball, for example, right? So that's not a big space that's working with the complexity of the game is not that crazy. You throw the ball over the net, the other team throws it back. It's volleyball with a medicine ball. So it's not that intense. There's not a lot of physical movement involved, but you're starting to get them used to reading where the ball is, reading where that player is going to be, where are their teammates if we want to volley to somebody and then they volley over the net or something like that. So you just start introducing these game principles that we talked about before. Then you can progress to something like simple invasion games. So for that could be reduced movement, but now we're adding in territories where you have to invade. So like Ultimate Frisbee is a great example because the guy who's holding the Frisbee can't move with the Frisbee, so that reduces overall movement. But now we're introducing a full field. It doesn't have to be an entire field space, but it could be just increased field space from what we were doing with the formation focus games. But we're still keeping the movement reduced, but we're adding in more group dynamic emphasis where you have the territory invasion, scoring, things like that. And then from there, you could progress, a sport like football, you could progress to doing something like a modified version of rugby, where players can move around freely now, but they can only pass the ball laterally or behind them, and they have to try to work together to get across a goal line and score. So Fergus just talks about building this basis of game intelligence. So because the principles are very similar for all these invasion team sports, if you are exposing them to various forms of invasion team sports, then they're going to develop just a basic game intelligence. They're just going to be a baller, basically. They could pick up any ball and figure out what to do with it, and the type of kid that can play football and basketball and lacrosse, and like they just have this game intelligence. And so, at the same time, we're working we're keeping intact the perception and the action. So instead of working the action all the time, just isolated, like in the weight room or doing sprints or cutting around cones or something like that, now we're adding in the brain element so that we have the perception and the action together, and that's allowing them to get comfortable psychologically. So say a player just doesn't feel like he can cover somebody man to man. Well, put him in these situations. His first couple reps, he might suck. He might not be that good. But then you tell the player, hey, listen, get your eyes on his hips. Like, just understand what he's doing. Just take a breath, figure it out. It's February. We don't have to be in training camp until August. You're good. Like, let's just focus on it. Or maybe you put that player against somebody who's not super advanced at first. He gets comfortable there. Then you put him against more advanced players, and now you can mix and match based on different player levels. And it just allows the team to come together in these game activities, and which just at the same time monitoring it as the coach, making sure that you're progressing the loading, progressing the field size from smaller spaces to bigger spaces. It's just a progression over the course of the off season. So now hopefully by the time they come into training camp, they've been playing versions of games from small spaces to big spaces, low complexity to high complexity. So now they're at the highest complexity in training camp, but they've scaled up to it instead of going from 0 to 100 like we were talking about before.
And it's interesting and keeps the interest, I don't want to say interest level, but it kind of just keeps the engagement high too.
Yes.
In the off season, kind of creating different scenarios and not the same old thing constantly.
Right.
Now in the last section, you're talking about winning and leadership. Obviously, maybe a little bit more philosophical, but go ahead and fill us in on what's in the book in that regard.
Yeah, so that was just, we wanted to keep intact different components of preparation in each level 1, level 2, level 3. So the emphasis that we place on different areas, like one is just understanding the game, right? The next one is understanding how to prepare for the game, and then another one would be understanding how to coach the game and how do you go into it. And that could be the head coach, it could be an assistant coach, it could be the strength coach. So we wanted to present just concepts of coaching in general, where a lot of it is just stuff that Fergus has learned from high level coaches that he's been involved with and that he's spoken to. Because it's amazing if you look at his resume of who he's communicated with, because it's not just coaches he directly worked for, but he's been in touch with just some of the best coaches all over the world, that he's collaborated with and consulted with and talked to. And just, for him, this is really his realm that he's learned, is all the lessons from. I mean, he literally wrote a whole book called 59 Lessons that he that
Yeah,
he's
right,
you know,
right.
59 lessons he's learned from these type of coaches. So um, what we want to present in this section is just sort of an introduction to where we're going to go with it, especially in level 3. Level 3 is really where we're going to touch on what are the characteristics and the traits of those who just sustain success. It's not somebody who wins one championship. What about the people that win 5 or more championships, multiple championships? How do they, or even if they're not winning a championship every year, they're in the picture every year. How do those type of people get to those levels? Like, what are they doing? What are the commonalities? So that's the stuff we want to present as the series goes on. So here was just an introduction to that, where Fergus assembled these 6 laws of winning that were just, they could be things like knowledge, obviously, like the coaches that just take an undying approach to just developing knowledge of their sport, how to prepare for the sport, right? It's like we talk about, if you could take a coach who has this undying just desire to really study the tactics of his or her sport, then taking that same fire and saying, well, how do I make sure my players are as fresh as possible to do everything I want to draw up on this whiteboard? And if they have that commitment to it, a lot of the best coaches from all over the world. That's the other thing, is Fergus has worked far outside of just the U.S. All over the world, they have that hunger of knowledge to understand the whole picture, right? Everything that we're trying to discuss. Then you could look at human superiority. So like, you win with people, right? It's just, you could have the greatest gadgets in the world, you could have all the sports science technology you want, but it's about winning with people and empowering the people around you as well. So if you bring in all these specialists and you expect them to just do something, with that, you need to give them some kind of roadmap here. Like, here's what
Right.
we're trying to do. Like, you can't just bring in, this guy from MIT who's a data analyst and just say, all right, make me win. It's like, well, what's the context? I mean, I didn't know what you guys are doing. Like, who are you guys? I don't even know what's going on. So
Yeah.
you win with people and empowering people so that everybody just feels like they have ownership in what's going on, and that they all feel like they're all committed to the greater whole, which is the team, and winning games and sustaining success, and not just winning one championship, but winning multiple championships. And so it's just, the 6 laws of winning cover different things like that. So law of preparation. What's your preparation style? How are you deciding to take care of your players and prepare that way, right? So we just talk about some 6 laws of winning there, and then also 4 primary principles of winning teams, which sounds obvious, but it's always good to be reminded of it. And it's humility, hunger, hard work, and honesty, right? And so that it's just, we could all take that lesson and really just pay attention to it, because how many of us in strength and conditioning have humility? I mean, it's just, that's a hard skill right there. We
Yeah.
all have hunger. We want to know more. We want to be the best. Like, that's great, right? And we all work pretty hard. We're committed to what we're doing. But I would say the first and the fourth, that humility and that honesty, those are like the best coaches, like they really pay attention to those areas. And I struggle with humility every day, just being honest. It's
Yeah.
really hard to just, when you've worked so hard to put something together, just to hear somebody say, I might do it differently. Yeah, it's just to have humility in that moment. You got to just, you ask why. It's exactly what you just said before, is if people just continue to ask why, and why do you do it that way, why am I doing it this way, you just, the more you can ask why, the more humility you're going to have. And honesty is important too. I mean, players are so much smarter than we give them credit for. If you're some type of guy who's BSing them as a strength coach or as a sport coach, we figure it out real quick,
Yeah.
or sorry, the players figure it out really quickly. who's BSing and who's not, so that they know like if it's working for them or if it's not. So it's like you said off air, right? Like what are the results? Like where the results will speak for themselves. So how do we get to that where we have the results? So that section is just an intro of where we're going to go with it. Especially in level 3, we're going to really touch on the coaching side of it for sure.
Yeah, I heard this conversation a lot about buy-in. People talk about buy-in.
Yep.
And I never even broached the subject because, looked into it because I'm like, well, if I'm doing what I'm supposed to do, I don't have to worry about buy-in, right? So if the athlete wants to be better as an athlete, right. So the strength and conditioning coach theoretically then should be that player's dream come true, not a guy that he looks at in a negative light. Because if I make him faster, quicker, jump higher, whatever it is, I'm helping him get exactly what he wants.
Yes.
From this, right? He wants to be a better athlete, so give it to him. If you're not giving it to him, then you need buy-in. Mm-hmm. because basically it's what you're getting him to buy BS. Is what
you got to sell yourself at that point.
You're tricking him.
Yep.
But if you just give him what he came for, you don't have to worry about buy-in. You say you're going to get this much faster by next season. And quantify it. Okay, and it happens. Well, hell, I guess I got to know what he's talking about. All right, good.
Right.
Do it again. It should be that simple, but it's not. And the reason why coaches do struggle with buying and whatnot is because you're selling something that they're not buying because you're not delivering on your end. It's easy I think that coaches are easy. They're great preachers, but they're not very good at listening to their own sermons. And and practicing what they preach, so I'm glad to hear, because I love knowing Fergus' approach, just being honest, authentic with the people. Hey, they need a result. Let's give it to them. That's it. That's the end of the story. Stop all the other distractions. Just give them what they came for. And if you do that, everything will be fine. Well, listen, I appreciate all your time. I know I took a good part of your early afternoon here, but I really appreciate it. This was cool because I learned some stuff here as well. I really like the approach, the pragmatism, and the expertise too. And like you said, Fergus knows everybody. I don't know if there's anybody he doesn't know. Every time we have a conversation, this coach from this league or that league or general manager, I'm like, everybody. Pretty much.
Yep.
But let's get back together and do this again when we get with level 2 and level 3. Let's do this again. I love the detail here that you're giving everybody and giving them a real sneak peek at the book and kind of, a great teaser. So let's get together and do this again. But thank you very much for your time today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much, man. It was a lot of fun. I really appreciate it.
Really good. All right. Well, we'll talk to you soon. Thanks again.
All right. Take care.